Looking back, it started with the little things, tiny cracks in the foundation of what I thought was a solid marriage. Sophie and I had been together for 8 years, and for most of that time, I believed we were happy. I was proud of us. We had built a life together, the kind of life you see in movies but never think you'll have for yourself. She was charming and confident, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and have everyone's attention without even trying. I loved that about her, but I never realized how much attention she might crave beyond what I could give. At first, the changes were so subtle I questioned if they were even real. Sophie seemed distracted. Her responses to me were shorter, her focus elsewhere. I chalked it up to work stress. She had just been promoted to a managerial role at her firm and had been putting in long hours. It made sense. Stress can change people. Or so I told myself. Then came the late-night texting. She'd sit on the couch, her phone angled away from me as she tapped out messages, occasionally letting out a quiet laugh or smile. When I asked what was funny, her answers were always vague. Just a friend, or work stuff, nothing exciting. I remember how she'd tuck her phone away the second I got close, like it was some reflex she couldn't control. Still, I let it slide, not wanting to seem paranoid. It wasn't just the texting. Sophie started staying out late more often, calling them girls' nights. I didn't question it at first. She had a tight group of friends who had been with her through thick and thin. But the frequency picked up, and there were no photos or stories shared afterward, nothing like before, when she'd come home excited to tell me about their adventures. Then there was the jewelry. She began wearing sleek bracelets and elegant earrings that I had never seen before, pieces that screamed luxury. When I asked where they came from, her answers were as vague as ever. Oh, just a gift, or it's nothing special. But I knew our budget, and I knew I hadn't bought them. What really struck me was how she only wore these pieces when she went out. At home, she kept it casual, the way she always had. But for those nights, she'd transform. Sophie's outfits became more polished, her makeup more deliberate. I told myself she just wanted to look good, it wasn't a crime. But deep down, I felt something shift, and I hated how unsure I was becoming about the person I trusted most. The turning point came on a Thursday night. Sophie said she was tired and went to bed early. I stayed up, tinkering with some work on my prototype mini robot, Juno, in the living room. Her phone was sitting on the counter, a rare occurrence since she usually kept it within arm's reach. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was all the little things piling up, or maybe it was just instinct. My hand was shaking as I picked it up. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but it didn't take long to find it. A message from someone named Alex popped up. It wasn't vague. It wasn't friendly. It was everything I feared. Dinner last night was perfect. Can't wait for this weekend. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt heavy, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I stared at the words, reading them over and over again, as if they might change. But they didn't. They were still there, mocking me. My mind raced, going from disbelief to anger, then to something colder, something calculating. I could have stormed into the bedroom right then, demanded answers, and unleashed all the anger I felt. But what would that have solved? She'd deny it, twist the story, maybe even make me feel like I was crazy. No, I needed more. I needed undeniable proof. My work had always been about strategy and precision, and now I was going to apply those skills to my marriage. If Sophie wanted to lie, I'd make sure the truth was louder. The next morning, I couldn't even look at Sophie. She moved around the house like nothing was wrong, humming to herself as she made coffee and packed her bag for work. Every so often, she'd glance at me with that same easy smile, the one that used to make me feel lucky to be her husband. Now, it just felt like a mask. I wanted to scream at her, to demand she tell me everything. But I knew I wasn't ready. Confrontation without evidence would just put her on alert, and I needed her guard down if I was going to find out the truth. As soon as she left, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where her phone had been the night before. My mind was racing with questions. Who was Alex? How long had this been going on? Was it serious, or just some fling? I wanted answers, but more than that, I wanted proof. Something she couldn't talk her way out of. That's when I remembered Juno. Juno was my pride and joy, a prototype I'd been developing for years in my spare time. It started as a passion project, a mini desktop robot designed to manage household chores, calendars, and even minor troubleshooting around the house. But over time, I'd pushed it further, equipping it with facial recognition, emotion analysis, and behavioral tracking. It was meant to be a helper, a companion to make life easier. I never imagined I'd need it for something like this. That morning, I decided to repurpose Juno. Instead of monitoring the house for scheduling conflicts or reminding us to take out the trash, it would now monitor Sophie. I worked all day fine-tuning the settings, programming it to record conversations, track her movements within the house, and analyze patterns in her behavior. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it was preparation. If Sophie was lying to me, Juno would uncover every detail. I felt a pang of guilt as I tested the system, watching the sleek little robot blink to life on the counter. This wasn't how I wanted to use something I'd poured so much of myself into. But the guilt was quickly overshadowed by the memory of that message from Alex. I deserved the truth, no matter how much it hurt to uncover. That evening, Sophie came home late, claiming she had to stay at work to finish a project. I kept my face neutral, pretending not to notice the faint smell of cologne on her jacket that wasn't mine. She kissed me on the cheek and asked how my day was, her tone as casual as ever. I told her it was fine, though my stomach churned with the effort of keeping my composure. If she noticed anything off about me, she didn't say. Over the next week, Juno collected everything. Conversations Sophie had when she thought she was alone, the time she came home late, the subtle lies she told about her whereabouts, all of it was logged and stored. I stayed quiet, letting her think I believed every excuse she gave. But every time she left the house, I found myself replaying the recordings, piecing together the truth bit by bit. The first real breakthrough came 3 days in. Sophie had a phone call in the living room while I was in the garage. Juno's sensitive microphones picked up every word. She laughed softly, saying Alex's name like it was some private joke between them. "This weekend?" "Yeah, I can make it work," she said, her voice light and teasing. My stomach twisted into a knot, but I forced myself to listen. She talked about where they could meet, what they'd do, and how much she was looking forward to it. It wasn't just infidelity, it was a whole other life she was living, one where I didn't exist. That night, I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling while she slept peacefully. My mind felt like it was running on overdrive. The evidence was piling up, and each piece hit me like a fresh wound. I'd catch glimpses of the Sophie I thought I knew, her laughter, her warmth, her charm, but it was tainted now. Everything was tainted. I could have confronted her then. I had more than enough to back up my suspicions. But something in me wanted to wait, to see just how deep this went. If Sophie thought she was clever, she hadn't reckoned with someone like me. By the end of the week, I had gathered enough evidence to fill a notebook. Juno was thorough. More thorough than I ever expected it to be. Every night after Sophie went to bed, I would sit in my workshop and sift through the recordings. It was like living in a nightmare, hearing her voice dripping with affection for another man, laughing at jokes I wasn't a part of, and planning her weekends like I was nothing but an afterthought. The recordings painted a picture that was hard to look at. Sophie wasn't just unfaithful, she was meticulous. She'd schedule her work trips or girls' nights with precision, ensuring I was either too busy or too distracted to notice. She'd erase messages and call logs from her phone, but Juno caught enough fragments to reconstruct her conversations. Alex's name came up repeatedly, and the way she said it made my stomach churn. There was intimacy in her tone, a softness I hadn't heard directed at me in a long time. One night, I watched a video Juno had captured from the kitchen. Sophie was on a video call with Alex. Her face lit up like she was 20 again and had just fallen in love for the first time. She laughed at something he said, twirling a strand of her hair between her fingers. The woman on the screen wasn't the Sophie I married. It was someone I didn't recognize, and the realization hit me harder than I expected. I rewound the clip, studying every detail. Her posture, her smile, the way she bit her lip as Alex said something I couldn't hear, it was all too much. I slammed my laptop shut and sat back, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. The betrayal wasn't just in the act. It was in the effort. Sophie had been so careful, so deliberate in hiding this from me, and that hurt more than anything else. I couldn't sit still after that. I paced the workshop, my thoughts bouncing between anger, sadness, and disbelief. Part of me still wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, to believe this was a mistake or something she'd been pressured into. But the recordings didn't lie. She wasn't just complicit, she was leading this double life. The next morning, Sophie left early for work. Juno alerted me when she crossed the threshold, logging her departure at 7:12 a.m. sharp. It was earlier than usual, and that raised a red flag. I checked her route on the tracking app I'd secretly synced to her phone. She wasn't heading to her office downtown. Instead, her GPS pinged at a cafe on the other side of the city, one I'd never heard her mention before. Curious, I grabbed my coat and followed. I parked a few blocks away, just out of sight, and watched as Sophie stepped out of her car. She wasn't dressed for work. Her usual pencil skirt and blazer were replaced by a flowy dress that hugged her in all the right places. She looked beautiful, which made the situation feel even worse. Alex arrived minutes later. He was taller than I expected, with the kind of confidence that seemed to come naturally. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and an arm around her waist, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I felt a rush of adrenaline as I snapped a few pictures from my phone, documenting the moment. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. They walked into the cafe together, laughing like two teenagers sneaking away from their parents. I stayed in my car, staring at the cafe entrance like it was a portal to another world, a world where Sophie had decided I didn't belong. I wanted to march in there and make a scene, to demand answers and watch her face crumble under the weight of her lies. But I knew that wasn't the right move. Not yet. By the time I got home, I felt like a shell of myself. My marriage, my trust, my sense of stability, it was all unraveling. But as I sat down and reviewed the photos I had taken, a new emotion began to creep in: determination. I wasn't going to let Sophie walk all over me. If she wanted to live a double life, she would face the consequences. This wasn't just about saving face or getting revenge. It was about regaining control. Control of my life, my dignity, and the truth. Sophie thought she was clever, but she had underestimated me. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, there would be no denying the picture they painted. The night Sophie came home from Herb Girls' Night, I was ready. My hands were steady as I placed the stack of divorce papers on the coffee table in front of me, the envelope slightly worn from the hours I'd spent holding it, waiting for her to walk through the door. I had rehearsed this moment in my head a dozen times, but now that it was here, the weight of it settled in my chest like a heavy stone. The sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoed as she entered. Sophie looked surprised to see me sitting there, still dressed in my work clothes. Usually, I was in bed by this time, pretending not to notice the nights she came home later than promised. Tonight was different though, and she seemed to sense it. "Hey," she said, dropping her purse on the counter. Her voice carried a casual warmth, like she was trying to diffuse whatever tension she felt in the air. "You're up late." I didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch. It was deliberate. I wanted her to feel the shift, to know this wasn't just another night of me brushing things under the rug. When I finally looked up, my expression must have given me away, because her smile faltered. "What's wrong?" she asked, taking a hesitant step toward me. I gestured to the envelope on the table. "Sit down," I said. My voice was calm, almost detached, but inside, I could feel the storm brewing. Sophie's eyes flicked to the papers, and for a split second, I saw something flash across her face. Fear, maybe, or guilt. She hesitated before lowering herself onto the couch, her movements slower than usual. She reached for the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. The moment she saw what was inside, her face went pale. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees as I met her gaze. "It's over, Sophie," I said. The words felt heavy, but there was also a strange sense of relief in saying them aloud. "I know about Alex. I know about everything." Her mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she sat there, clutching the papers like they might disappear if she held them tightly enough. Her eyes darted back and forth, searching for something to say, some way to explain herself. "You've been lying to me for months," I continued, my tone measured but firm. "I've given you every chance to tell me the truth, but you didn't. So now I'm done." Sophie finally found her voice, but it was shaky and defensive. "Ethan, This is insane. I don't know what you think you know, but... I cut her off, leaning back and folding my arms across my chest. Don't, I said sharply. Don't insult me by pretending you're innocent. I have the recordings, Sophie. I know about the messages, the calls, the meetings. I know about the hotel rooms. So don't sit there and lie to my face. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. But then her expression hardened, and she tried to regain control of the situation. You were spying on me, she demanded, her voice rising. What the hell, Ethan? That's... Don't try to make this about me, I snapped. You don't get to play the victim here. Not after what you've done. The room fell silent, the weight of the truth hanging between us like a storm cloud. Sophie stared at me, her face a mix of anger and disbelief. So that's it? She asked finally, her voice trembling. You're just giving up on us? I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. You gave up on us a long time ago, I said. I'm just making it official. I stood then, towering over her as she sat there clutching the papers. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control, like I wasn't just reacting to her lies but taking back my life. Sign the papers, I said, my voice steady. You can keep whatever story you need to tell yourself to justify what you did, but I'm done. With that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving Sophie sitting there in stunned silence. The sound of the front door closing behind me felt final, like the end of a chapter I'd been trying to rewrite for far too long. The night after handing Sophie the divorce papers, I stayed in a cheap motel just outside of town. The room smelled faintly of bleach, and the bed was stiff, but I didn't care. I needed space, a physical distance from the life I had shared with Sophie. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind was a battlefield of emotions. Anger, sadness, relief, and an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The next morning, I turned on my phone to a barrage of missed calls and messages from Sophie. I didn't bother reading them. There was nothing she could say that would change anything. I ignored the notifications and focused on the next steps. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and now it was time to follow through. Before leaving the motel, I called my lawyer. He assured me that everything was in place, that Sophie wouldn't be able to manipulate her way out of the agreement. The paperwork was airtight, and I had the evidence to back it up. You've done your part, he said. Now, let the process take care of the rest. Despite his reassurance, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. It wasn't just about the legalities, it was about what came next. What would my life look like without Sophie in it? I drove back to the house to pack some of my things, unsure of what to expect. When I walked in, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. The divorce papers lay open in front of her, the pen untouched. I didn't sign them, she said, her voice breaking the silence. We need to talk. I sighed, setting my keys on the counter. There's nothing to talk about, I said firmly. She stood, her hands trembling as she gestured to the papers. Ethan, please. I made a mistake, but we can work through this. Don't throw everything away over one bad decision. I stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on me. One bad decision? I repeated, my tone bitter. You didn't just make a mistake, Sophie. You lied to me. 4 months. Do you even realize how much damage you've done? She flinched, her eyes filling with tears. I know I hurt you, she said, her voice shaking. But we can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything. Please, Ethan, just give me a chance. For a moment, I hesitated. A part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that we could somehow salvage the wreckage of our marriage. But then I thought about Alex, about the recordings, the photos, the blatant disrespect she had shown me. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with promises and apologies. I gave you chances, Sophie, I said quietly. I gave you every opportunity to tell me the truth, to come clean. But you didn't. You let me believe in a lie. I can't come back from that. Her tears fell freely now, but I didn't feel the same urge to comfort her that I once would have. Instead, I turned and headed upstairs to pack. Each step felt heavier than the last, but I knew this was the right thing to do. By the time I came back down, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, Sophie was sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. I paused, a strange mix of pity and resentment swirling in my chest. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. And with that, I left. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest glimmer of freedom. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a start. I was unpacking the last of my boxes when my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with Sophie's parents' names. For a moment, I hesitated, debating whether to let it go to voicemail. Margaret and Charles had always been good to me, but after everything that had happened, I wasn't sure if I was ready to talk to them. Curiosity won out. I picked up, and Margaret's voice greeted me, soft but urgent. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Ethan, we need to talk. Can you come by tonight?" Her tone left no room for debate. I agreed reluctantly. They wouldn't tell me much over the phone, only that it was important. I couldn't help but feel a knot of unease as I hung up. That evening, I found myself standing at their front door, a place that once felt like family but now felt foreign. Margaret opened the door quickly, her face lined with worry. She hugged me briefly, saying, "Thank you for coming." Inside, Charles was waiting in the living room, his usual calm demeanor replaced with something heavier. I sat across from them, the tension in the room almost suffocating. Margaret started, her voice trembling slightly. "We're so sorry about everything Sophie's done to you. If we'd known." I nodded but stayed silent. Then Charles spoke, his words careful and deliberate. "This isn't just about her affair, Ethan. It's about the family trust. We've discovered irregularities." He exchanged a look with Margaret before continuing. "Sophie's been siphoning money from it for years." I stared at them, trying to process what I was hearing. This wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. And from her own family. "We need your help," Margaret said, her voice almost pleading. "You have the skills to figure out exactly what she's done. We don't know who else to turn to." I took a deep breath, the weight of their request sinking in. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll see what I can do." The next morning, I dove into the task at hand. My apartment still felt impersonal, its walls bare and furniture minimal, but I wasn't focused on settling in. Instead, I turned my makeshift workspace into a hub of investigation. My laptop hummed quietly, Juno perched beside it like a silent partner in crime. Margaret and Charles had sent over the financial documents they could access, a mix of spreadsheets and account statements that hinted at something far more sinister than simple mismanagement. As I scanned through the files, my mind kept returning to one thing Margaret had said. Sophie had been siphoning money for years. To dig deeper, I called Max, an old college friend and a cybersecurity expert. He was the kind of guy who thrived on puzzles like this, and I knew he wouldn't hesitate to help. When I explained the situation, his reaction was immediate. "Send me everything," he said, his tone serious. I uploaded the files and forwarded them to him, then spent the next few hours reviewing Juno's recordings and logs. While Juno wasn't designed for financial analysis, it had collected enough data on Sophie's behavior to provide context. There were snippets of conversations, mentions of account numbers, and references to expenses that didn't align with her supposed income. By late afternoon, Max called back. "Ethan, this isn't just small-scale fraud," he said, his voice tense. "The transfers from the trust lead to offshore accounts, all under different aliases. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of his words settling over me. "You're saying Sophie didn't act alone?" "Exactly," Max replied. "The pattern is too intricate." I cross-referenced some of the account activity with public records, and Alex's name keeps popping up. My guess? He's the mastermind, and Sophie's been helping him move the money. Hearing Alex's name made my blood boil. The affair had already destroyed my marriage, but now it was clear that their betrayal ran far deeper. They weren't just liars, they were criminals, stealing from Sophie's own family to fund their lives. Max continued, "The transactions line up with some of the gifts and trips you mentioned. This guy isn't just some fling. He's using Sophie, and she's willingly going along with it. Can you trace it back to him definitively?" I asked. "Not yet, but I'm working on it." "I'll keep digging," Max promised. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day piecing together everything I'd learned. I compiled a detailed report for Margaret and Charles, outlining what Max had uncovered and attaching supporting documents. When I called to explain, I could hear the heartbreak in Margaret's voice. How could she do this, she murmured, more to herself than to me. Charles was angrier. Whatever it takes, we're putting a stop to this, he said firmly. I reassured them that Max and I would keep working until we had a complete picture of Sophie and Alex's scheme. We'll need to take this to the authorities soon, I added. That night, as I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, I felt an unfamiliar mix of emotions. There was anger, of course. Anger at Sophie and Alex for their lies and manipulation. But there was also a sense of clarity, a determination to see this through. Sophie had underestimated me, thinking she could keep her secrets buried. Now, I was pulling them into the light, one by one. Over the next few days, Max and I worked tirelessly. He continued tracing the offshore accounts and piecing together the connections between Sophie and Alex. Meanwhile, I sifted through Juno's recordings, cross-referencing the snippets of conversations I'd collected with the financial data. The more I uncovered, the clearer their scheme became, and the angrier I grew. Sophie wasn't just complicit. She had been actively involved. There were recorded phone calls where she casually discussed moving things around, and referenced account names Max had flagged. In one clip, she laughed with Alex about a close call, when Margaret had almost noticed a discrepancy. The callousness in her voice made my stomach churn. Max called late one evening with another update. "Ethan, I've got something big," he said, his tone sharper than usual. "One of the accounts Sophie's been transferring money to? It links directly to a shell company Alex owns. He's been funneling the funds into investments, real estate, crypto, you name it. Does he have a way to hide it if this blows up?" I asked. "He's covered his tracks well," Max admitted. "But not perfectly. If we present this to the right people, they won't have a hard time unraveling it. Sophie's involvement, though, it's all over the place. She's been signing off on transactions, even sending emails that implicate her directly." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Sophie wasn't just a victim of Alex's manipulation. She was a willing participant. "Keep digging," I said. "The more evidence we have, the better." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about how far Sophie had fallen. The woman I had married was smart, driven, and kind, or at least I thought she was. But now, I was seeing a side of her I never imagined existed. Selfish, reckless, and willing to betray anyone to get what she wanted. The next morning, I met with Margaret and Charles to share what we'd found so far. Their house felt different, less welcoming, as if Sophie's actions had tainted even the air inside. They listened intently as I explained the connections Max had uncovered, their expressions shifting from shock to anger as the full scope of the scheme came into view. "This isn't just fraud," I said, handing them copies of the documents. "It's a coordinated effort to siphon money out of the trust and launder it through Alex's businesses. And Sophie is directly involved." Charles clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "We trusted her with everything," he muttered. "How could she do this to her own family?" Margaret didn't say much, her eyes brimming with tears as she flipped through the papers. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "We take this to the authorities," I said firmly. "But first, we need to make sure we have everything. Once Max finishes his investigation, we'll have an airtight case. They won't be able to talk their way out of this." For a moment, Margaret looked at me, her expression a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. "I'm sorry you were dragged into this, but we're so grateful for your help." As I left their house, a strange sense of resolve settled over me. Sophie and Alex had spent years building their lies, but now the truth was catching up to them. It was only a matter of time before their house of cards came crashing down. And I would be there to make sure it did. Max and I worked late into the night for weeks, piecing together the final threads of Sophie and Alex's operation. Each new document, email, or financial statement added another nail to the coffin. By the time we were done, we had enough evidence to not only expose their scheme but to bring it to the attention of the authorities and initiate legal action. The case was airtight. Bank transfers showed Sophie moving money from the family trust into offshore accounts. Emails between her and Alex detailed how they'd laundered those funds through shell companies tied to him. Juno's recordings, combined with digital records, proved her active role in the theft. Max connected me with a high-profile attorney he knew from his line of work. Her name was Dana, and she was the kind of lawyer who didn't take on cases unless she knew she could win. When I handed her the file, she flipped through it in silence for several minutes. Finally, she looked up and said, "This is solid. They don't stand a chance." Dana wasted no time drafting the lawsuit. It wasn't just against Sophie and Alex. We also targeted the shell companies Alex had set up, ensuring he couldn't shift blame onto the business entities to protect himself. Margaret and Charles, furious and heartbroken, joined the suit as co-plaintiffs. They were determined to get back what Sophie had stolen, even if it meant seeing their own daughter face legal consequences. When the lawsuit was officially filed, it sent shockwaves through Sophie's world. I'll never forget the moment she found out. She called me in a panic, her voice shaking as she demanded to know what I'd done. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a long conversation. "You know exactly what I've done," I said coldly before hanging up. The case quickly gained traction. The evidence Max and I had compiled was overwhelming, and it didn't take long for law enforcement to get involved. Sophie and Alex were served subpoenas, and Alex's accounts were frozen within days. Watching them squirm under the pressure of the legal system was oddly satisfying, though it didn't erase the bitterness of their betrayal. Sophie tried to paint herself as a victim, claiming Alex had manipulated her into helping him. But the emails, recordings, and financial records told a different story. Dana dismantled her defense piece by piece, exposing her as an active participant in the scheme. Alex, on the other hand, tried to play it cool. He showed up to the initial hearings with a high-priced lawyer and a smug attitude, but that quickly evaporated as the evidence piled up. It was clear he had underestimated just how much we had uncovered. The trial was grueling, stretching over several months, but in the end, the verdict was exactly what we'd hoped for. Sophie and Alex were found liable for embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The court ordered them to repay the stolen funds, along with substantial damages for the harm they'd caused. Sophie's assets were seized to cover part of the restitution, and Alex's entire operation was dismantled. Watching the judge hand down the decision was a moment I'll never forget. It wasn't just about the money, it was about finally seeing justice served. As I walked out of the courtroom that day, Margaret and Charles thanked me again for everything I'd done. Their family might never fully recover from Sophie's betrayal, but at least they had closure. For me, the lawsuit wasn't just about justice, it was about reclaiming my life. Sophie had taken so much from me, but now, for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally move forward. The courtroom was packed the day the verdict was read. I sat next to Margaret and Charles, their presence steadying me as the judge delivered the decision. Sophie and Alex were found guilty of fraud and embezzlement, their elaborate scheme laid bare for everyone to see. The judge ordered full restitution of the stolen funds, along with additional damages for the emotional and financial harm caused. Alex, whose smug attitude had long since disappeared, looked pale and defeated. Sophie sat frozen, her face unreadable as reality sank in. For a brief moment, I wondered if she truly regretted what she'd done, but then I remembered the emails, the lies, and the months of betrayal. If there was regret, it came far too late. After the verdict, Margaret and Charles turned to me, their expressions a mix of relief and sorrow. Charles shook my hand firmly, his voice low but resolute. "We couldn't have done this without you, Ethan." "Thank you." Margaret, who had been holding back tears throughout the trial, hugged me tightly. "I'm so sorry for everything," she whispered. "You didn't deserve this. None of it." I didn't know what to say. Their daughter had torn my life apart, yet here they were, standing by me as if I were still part of their family. In that moment, their gratitude and kindness felt like a balm for wounds I didn't even realize I was still nursing. Over the weeks that followed, Sophie and Alex faced the fallout from the trial. Sophie lost everything: the money, her reputation, and even the support of her parents. Margaret and Charles had made it clear they loved their daughter, but they couldn't condone what she'd done. They told me later that they were heartbroken, not just for the theft but for the way Sophie had destroyed her relationships. Despite everything, Margaret and Charles stayed in touch with me. They invited me over for dinners, checked in on me regularly, and even helped me furnish my new apartment. Their support was a constant in a time when everything else felt uncertain. One evening, as we sat in their living room after dinner, Charles poured us each a glass of bourbon and spoke quietly. "You know, Ethan, when we first met you, we knew you were special. We couldn't have asked for a better man for Sophie." He paused, his expression heavy with regret. We're sorry she didn't see that. We're sorry for all of it. Margaret nodded, her eyes misty. You're still family to us, Ethan, she said softly. We know we can never replace your parents, but if you ever need us, we're here. Always. Their words hit me harder than I expected. My parents had passed years ago, leaving a void I'd carried quietly ever since. Margaret and Charles couldn't replace them, but their kindness filled some of that emptiness, giving me a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in a long time. As time went on, our relationship grew stronger. They became a fixture in my life, not just as Sophie's parents but as friends, mentors, and a connection to the past I had shared with their family. While Sophie's betrayal had shattered so much, it hadn't destroyed everything. From the wreckage, I had found something unexpected, a new kind of family. And in that, there was healing. After the trial, I knew I needed a fresh start. Winning had brought a sense of closure, but the weight of everything that had happened was still there. The apartment I had moved into, while functional, felt like a reminder of the life I'd left behind. Every time I came home, I was met with echoes of the past. Memories I didn't want to carry any longer. So, I decided to leave. Not just the apartment, but the town entirely. It wasn't an easy decision. Margaret and Charles had become like family, and the thought of moving away from their support gave me pause. But when I told them my plan, they didn't try to stop me. Margaret hugged me tightly. You deserve a fresh start, Ethan, she said, her voice full of encouragement. Wherever you go, you know we'll always be here for you. Charles added, this is your time to figure out what's next. Don't look back. Just move forward. With their blessing, I started packing up. Among the things I boxed away was Juno. The little robot had been a key part of uncovering Sophie's lies, but now, every time I looked at it, I was reminded of how far things had gone off course. I had poured years into developing Juno, dreaming of turning it into something that could help people, but after everything, the project didn't feel the same. It had become too tied to what I had lost. So, I made the decision to leave it as it was, a home prototype, a personal project that would never see the light of day. When the last of my things were packed, I loaded up my car and hit the road. I didn't have a firm destination in mind, just a desire to escape, to breathe, to put distance between myself and the life I was leaving behind. I decided to take a trip to the Pacific Northwest, a place I'd always wanted to visit but never made time for. The winding roads, towering forests, and misty coastlines were exactly what I needed. It felt like the world was resetting around me, giving me space to think and simply exist without the noise of the past crowding in. For weeks, I drifted between small towns and scenic spots, letting the stillness of nature do its work. I hiked trails that left me breathless, watched sunsets that painted the sky in fiery hues, and even spent a few nights camping under the stars. It was the kind of peace I hadn't realized I was craving. One evening, as I stood on a rocky beach watching the waves crash against the shore, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but a quiet one, a sense that I was finally letting go. Not just of Sophie, but of the bitterness, the anger, and the constant need to make sense of what had happened. I stayed there until the sun dipped below the horizon, the cold ocean air wrapping around me. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was simply there, alive, and ready to see what came next. When I returned from my trip, I felt lighter, as if the weight of the past had loosened its grip on me. The weeks spent in nature had given me clarity, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't just about moving forward, it was about building something new, something better. I had barely unpacked when I received an email that caught my attention. It was from a top AI development firm I'd admired for years. They were recruiting for a senior position focused on cutting-edge research and development in machine learning. I read the job description twice, my pulse quickening with each line. It was the kind of work I'd always dreamed of, challenging, innovative, and at the forefront of the industry. The position would be demanding, but it came with a compensation package that made my jaw drop. More importantly, it was a chance to immerse myself in the world of AI in a way I'd never been able to before. It was as if the universe had handed me exactly what I needed at just the right time. Without hesitation, I sent in my application. The interview process was rigorous, a 3-round gauntlet of technical challenges, panel interviews, and a final presentation. It was the toughest hiring process I'd ever been through, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. 2 weeks later, I got the call. "We're excited to offer you the position," the voice on the other end said. I accepted immediately, my heart racing with a mix of relief and excitement. For the first time since everything fell apart with Sophie, I felt like I was stepping into something that was entirely mine, a future built on my own terms. The work was exactly what I had hoped for and more. I spent my days tackling complex algorithms, refining neural networks, and collaborating with some of the brightest minds in the field. The pace was relentless, but I thrived on it. Every challenge felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved, and every success was a reminder that I was good at what I did. The pay was better than anything I'd ever earned, allowing me to rebuild my life comfortably. I moved into a sleek new apartment closer to the office, filling it with things that reflected who I was now, not who I had been with Sophie. More importantly, the job gave me purpose again. It wasn't just about the work itself, though I loved every minute of it. It was about proving to myself that I could rise above the chaos of the past, that I was more than the man Sophie had betrayed. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. The long days and late nights didn't feel like a burden. They felt like a privilege, a chance to finally live the life I'd always wanted. And for the first time, I was excited about the future. Whatever came next, I was ready. Settling into my new life, I realized something was missing. The sleek, modern apartment and my dream job made things feel stable and fulfilling, but the space still felt too quiet, too empty. After some thought, I decided it was time to add a companion to my life. I'd always loved cats but never had one growing up. The timing had never felt right. There was always an excuse: work, travel, or responsibilities. But now, I had a stable routine and the means to care for one. So, on a crisp Saturday morning, I visited a local animal shelter. That's where I met Luna. She was a small gray tabby with a striking streak of white along her nose and the brightest green eyes I'd ever seen. She wasn't shy but wasn't overly eager either. She walked up to me, gave a little headbutt, and then curled up next to my leg. That was it. She'd chosen me. Bringing Luna home was one of the best decisions I'd made in a long time. She settled in quickly, alternating between exploring every corner of the apartment and napping on my keyboard while I worked. She was playful but had a calming presence, reminding me to take breaks and enjoy the little things. My job continued to be everything I'd hoped for. Each day brought new challenges, and I found myself immersed in exciting projects. The team I worked with was sharp, collaborative, and just as passionate about AI as I was. It felt incredible to be surrounded by people who shared my enthusiasm and pushed me to do my best. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years. Ben, one of my closest friends from college. We'd lost touch after graduation, each of us caught up in our own lives, but seeing him again felt like no time had passed. We grabbed coffee and spent hours catching up. Ben had moved back to the city recently and was working in tech as well. Hearing about his life and sharing my own experiences felt refreshing, like reconnecting with a part of myself I'd forgotten. From that day on, Ben and I made it a point to meet up regularly. Whether it was grabbing dinner, going for hikes, or just hanging out and playing video games, it was good to have someone I could talk to, someone who knew me before everything fell apart. With Luna waiting for me at home, a job that challenged and inspired me, and an old friend back in my life, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: happiness. It wasn't the fleeting kind, the surface-level joy that comes and goes. It was a deeper, quieter sense of contentment, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, I was exactly where I was meant to be. As I sat on the couch one evening, Luna purring softly in my lap, I looked around the apartment. It wasn't just a place to live anymore. It was home. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just moving on. I was building a life I could truly love.